In times of crisis, people marginalized by long-standing inequalities feel the strongest effects. But how do we dismantle barriers and offer practical solutions to bring everyone to the decision-making table in a genuine way? Dig deeper with us and two of the UN Secretary General's outspoken SDG advocates. Anyone following the social good and sustainable development spaces, especially in recent years, knows what a powerful ongoing conversation there is to be had about disproportionate impact. The notion that in times of crisis, it's the most vulnerable, the furthest behind, who through no fault of their own invariably bear the brunt. What that actually means, though, in real terms to real people, has perhaps never been more heartbreakingly obvious on a global scale than in the COVID-19 pandemic. Consider these insights from this year's SDG Progress Report. 71 million people are expected to be pushed back into extreme poverty in 2020, the first rise in global poverty since 1998. Lost incomes, limited social protection, and rising prices mean even those who were previously secure could find themselves at risk of poverty and hunger. School closures have kept 90% of students worldwide, or 1.57 billion children, out of school, and caused over 370 million children to miss out on school meals they depend on, while lack of access to computers and the internet at home means remote learning is out of reach of many. And as more families fall into extreme poverty, children in poor and disadvantaged communities are at much greater risk of child labor, child marriage, and child trafficking. In fact, the global gains in reducing child labor are likely to be reversed for the first time in 20 years. The report also shows that climate change is still occurring much faster than anticipated. 2019 was the second warmest on record, which marked the end of the warmest decade of 2010 to 2019. Meanwhile, increasing desertification, ocean acidification, and crop damage like the devastating locust swarms we saw in Africa this year are all affecting Indigenous and vulnerable communities disproportionately. Facing this unfolding crisis, it's more critical than ever that we focus on inclusion, on leaving no one behind, and on making sure that the most important people not only have a seat at the table, but that they are heard. So today, as we continue to explore the theme of people, we're going to hear from two of the Secretary General's SDG advocates, two true champions for people. Hindou Ibrahim is the founder of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, AFPAT, National Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. She's from Chad and is a leading voice for Indigenous rights and climate change. Bonjour, Hindou.
Bonjour.
We are so happy to see you. Joining her is Ndopu from South Africa. Eddie is an award-winning humanitarian and activist and a leading voice for people with disabilities around the world. Hi, Eddie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. To start our session, I'm going to give the floor to Eddie and Hindou to give a joint talk, and then I'll rejoin the conversation to dive deeper into the issues with them and with you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's really nice to see you, and especially in this time of COVID where we cannot meet physically. I missed you, and I missed you, brother Eddie. So I think this is also our conversation who take us here as SDG advocate. We can get adapt to any circumstance and move forward because it is objective to help us fill all our tasks. So Eddie, I just wanted to converse with you about what have you learned from the world responding to the COVID-19?
Well, my sister, it really is wonderful to be in conversation with you. I think the one thing that I've learned is that COVID-19 has really brought into sharp focus the ways in which the same groups of marginalized people continue to bear the brunt of crisis after crisis after crisis. As a person with a physical disability who moves through the world in a wheelchair, I myself have had to be vigilant about what the pandemic means in my own life. And it has been disheartening to see the fact that people have not explicitly named people with disabilities in the conversation around COVID. We keep speaking about people with underlying conditions, but we never explicitly name the people who live through this reality, and those are people with disabilities. And you know, as somebody also from the continent of Africa like you, my dear, I am increasingly worried about the economic fallout of COVID-19 and the fact that we need to negotiate not just the fact that we are disproportionately impacted by COVID, but that we are almost left to our own devices when it comes to recovery. So, Hindou, my mind is really racing in terms of the state of the world. The stakes have never been higher. And I guess I'm keen to know from you, my dear, what have you learned and what is it that you're seeing as an advocate for Indigenous people and just as a global leader?
Well, my brother, you say, well, I'm going to take it from that one. It's still like all the crises from climate change to biodiversity loss to this pandemic of COVID, it's hitting more and more the most vulnerable communities and then the most poor peoples who are left behind because there are no education, no school, no access to the clean water. And when the pandemic comes, it's become a top crisis in the climate change who exist already in our communities. So when you go to the indigenous communities, there are no access to the clean water to drink. And when we talk about the measures of COVID, we say at least wash your hand 4 times a day. So you don't have the clean water to drink for yourself. How are you going to using it to wash your hands? So the consequence of the sickness, it's one thing. But after that, all the measures, accessing to the market, no sharing of knowledge or informations that relevant to the communities because they don't have access to the radio and TV. So I experienced that a lot in my communities. But however, many indigenous communities come together. We call each others to exchange our experience from our communities, how we can keep our elders safe, and how we can feed our peoples, even there is no market, to exchange the product informally. So that's helped a lot to fight this COVID. And it is also a wake up for us to say, if the work come overnight to change all the models on all the sickness, we can do that for climate change. Because if we keep our environment safe, our health will be safe. We all depend from the nature. And then when we are impacted, of course, people with disability, indigenous peoples, women, children, youth are the front line of all. We saw that. But we are also the solution. That's the thing people can take. So we take these solutions, we turn it to green recovery for the most vulnerable communities, those who are left behind. But at the same time, my brother, I'm really wonder with all what is happening, what's give you hope?
You know, Hindus, you said it. We are the solutions. The people that are disproportionately affected, you and me, our communities, we are the solution. And the solution, I think, is to have an intersectional approach to the recovery. We need to recognize that we embody a multiplicity of experiences at the same time. Like you said, we are Indigenous, we are disabled, we are women, we are young people at the same time. So we need to do away with the current public policy approach, which seeks to compartmentalize our identities, compartmentalize our experiences, and recognize that the solutions lie with the communities themselves. You know, like you were saying earlier, we are speaking to each other. Indigenous communities are talking to each other. Disabled communities are speaking to each other. And so it is time that our voices get amplified at the forefront of the global agenda. This is what leaders need to recognize. So the time is over of people speaking on our behalf, right? That is not what is required. What is required is not even for us to feel good about the fact that we leave nobody behind. It's not just a moral obligation. This is the political obligation. This is exactly what needs to happen. We are the ones that need to be ushering humanity into a new era, into a completely new vision of doing things. So that's what gives me hope, Hindou. And I think another thing that gives me hope is sitting with you. You know, I am extraordinarily lucky to call you a friend and a sister, and I really look up to the work that you do with Indigenous communities, and I learned so much. So I suppose, you know, given the urgency, not just of COVID, but the urgency of climate, what are the solutions? What do you think we need to be doing differently? And to use your words, what is the wake-up call for leaders that you see?
Sure. I mean, you also said in your response, what we need to do differently, it's giving the peoples who do not have voices the place in the tables to sit and take the decisions. So we can't be just be informed or be beneficiaries. We need to be sitting into the decision-making tables. So politicians, private sectors, all the big organizations need to think differently. The time change and then the system change. We are holding also the solutions. Indigenous peoples get a traditional knowledge that can help us to restore our biodiversity, to help us live in harmony back with the nature. And if we live back good with the nature, it's help us to get a healthier planet and a healthier human being. And we can get also out from the food insecurity, from so many of the SDGs goals. So that need to happen. We need to talk for ourselves. We can't sit down and then be just represented by other peoples. And secondly, we all know that peoples are working around the vaccine for the COVID. Hopefully we can get it and all of us will get this vaccine. But one thing, environment degradation have no vaccine, and we can't wear the mask and hide from it. We can't build the world and we cannot get impacted. So we need a partnership. This is the 17 goals, all of us coming together and acting in a green recovery for the most vulnerable peoples, for those who are left behind. And we need to localize the SDGs. And that's where it is solutions. So when we have localized it, people can get education, they get health, they get safety, environment, and they can decide for the future that they want. What we want, the better future for all of us, where the future respect the rights of people with disability, respect the rights of women, of indigenous peoples. So this future, we can build it all together. Thank you so much for all what you are saying. I'm always learning from you. So now I leave it over to Christian to moderate the rest of our session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my dear.
Thank you so much, Eddie and Hindou. And we are in a virtual environment, as we all realize. Usually we're all together and getting to spend time together. So I'm actually Nadira Hira, our MC, your MC for the SDG Action Zone. And I'm so happy to be with you. But in this new world, where we're using different technologies and trying to figure out how to actually be together when we can't be together, we're figuring out all the glitches and all the fun things and actually moving forward. But maybe we could start the conversation there. It is challenging to think about these times that we're in, right? And this conversation is really about how many people have been left behind traditionally, but how we're also seeing them being even more left behind now. And there are opportunities. Obviously, we've seen the world radically change as we've discussed already, or you've discussed, but there are also real issues of access. So how do we have this conversation when so many people don't even have the ability to be here? It is wonderful that we can be virtual. It's wonderful that people can join from all over the world, but that's still only a certain subset of people. So could you both reflect on how we move that forward? And it applies in both of your communities, obviously, very much, because it's not just about wireless or access, it's also about access, broadly speaking, access to everything.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really important question, because as a disability justice advocate, I'm always, it's important for me to make people understand that we need access beyond the built environment, right? When I'm advocating for accessibility, I'm not just talking about a ramp. I'm not just talking about Braille. I'm not just talking about sign language interpretation. It is about access to dignity, to self-actualization. It's about access to justice and equality, and the prospects of a truly meaningful and productive life, right? The ability to breathe freely in the world, regardless of who you are or where you come from. So I mean, I don't know how you feel, Hindou, but I think this idea of accessibility, when we think about access to the earth, access to land, access to water, access to all of these things that seem nebulous on the face of it, but actually when you dig deep, these are the building blocks of a life that is of a life of meaning. And so it's really important to push back that we're not just talking about, you know, the minimum threshold. This is not just about surviving on $1, $2, $3 a day. No, this is about the ability to be able to live a truly dignified life. It's about access to all of it, I think.
Yes, totally agree with you. Access to all, it's really very important. Access to land, to territories, to resources, to waters. But in this time of COVID, as you said also, Christian, we are maybe lucky to get access to a computer, to electricity, and to internet to be here. But how many peoples are going online to get access to a webinars? Many, millions are left behind, and those who are left behind are the usual, the developing countries. You know, during, I attended some of the webinars during an official climate change meeting. So there was no people from developing countries. There was no representative from my country, Chad. The reason why, because he didn't get the electricity to charge his computers. And then when he get like a light to do it, there is no internet that's running. When he get the internet, he managed after like 1 hour to get in. There is no interpretation language in French that he can understand. At the end of the day, he just like block out like this. So there is really a big war between the reality of the peoples and this new world we are moving on it. So that's why like we do not know when we are going out from this COVID, of course. Maybe it will take a while, but by the time, the people's life will be always continuous and degraded. So we need to think in a justice way, as Eddie said, equity, inclusiveness, to think not only about ourselves who get this access, but about the peoples who do not have access forever, about my grandmother or my aunties who do not know how to turn on just the light so they can't talk about the radio, TV, or whatever. Are we going to leave them in this 21st centuries like this? I think no. So we have the renewable energy who can give these solutions. We have to. And all the world state have to invest in this renewable energy to give access and equity.
So what's the balance we strike? Because everything you're saying is intuitive. If people don't realize that, then they're not paying attention, right? So I'm curious though, because it is so important for all of this action to be localized, as you've said, for it to be with the communities who it actually affects, because those communities know best what they need and how to move themselves forward. At the same time, we have all these people who do have access, communities that are able to contribute, and we have leaders who in theory need to do this work and are being pushed by their communities in ways we've never seen before, by their citizens to move the ball forward. What do we tell them to do? What do those people who do have the advantages of access, or who are even leading organizations or leading nations, what are the practical things that you both hear and see and feel that need to actually happen, that those people can take as actions to actually affect this conversation?
Well, I think we need to be very blunt and crystal clear here. I think the people that need to be threatened with the prospect of being left behind are the leaders that are opposed to the agenda of leaving nobody behind. So instead of leaving behind the communities who are experiencing compounded forms of oppression, compounded forms of exclusion, and compounded forms of vulnerability, let's turn the gaze and actually squarely look leaders in the eye who refuse to step aside and amplify the voices of those furthest behind the line of opportunity. So I think that we are now in a space where we need to really be very clear about demanding accountability. I think this idea of having an international development and humanitarian framework that rests on generosity and benevolence is no longer going to cut it. I think that we need an international development system that is actually predicated on the principles of justice, equality, and fairness. This isn't a question of favors, right? Nobody's doing one group a favor, right? So we need to completely divest from that mindset altogether, right? And I think it's about holding leaders, holding their feet to the fire, for lack of a better phrase, in terms of the obligations that they've signed onto. Remember, the Sustainable Development Goals is a compact. It is an agreement. It is a declaration that 193 member states of the United Nations signed onto in 2015. It's not something that can just be swept away as a nice to have. This is a declaration about people, planet, and partnerships. And so for activists, I think it's about really holding leaders to their fire. And it's not a question of benevolence or generosity. This is a question of justice and equality.
But I agree. And I think that underscoring that the people's agenda is absolutely not an abstract is so important, because it's so easy as we continue this conversation to sort of be in the feedback loop of it as a conversation rather than about action. But I think it's so important to mobilize citizens. And as we've seen in all the movements of the past year, including the racial justice movement that we saw unfold, citizens are more activated than we've ever seen, certainly in my lifetime, though we know that there have been traditions of activism over the years. So how do we use that? I mean, are people writing letters? Do we want them to be posting on social media? Is there more that they can do? Do they need to take to the streets? What are the practical actions that regular citizens who are not part of these communities but want to support in an authentic way the causes of these communities can actually take to advance the cause and to support you in the work that you're doing? Hindou, why don't you reflect on that for us a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think different groups can take different action who can lead to these same solutions. So when you are in developed countries, and then you know that your leader is not supporting the justice for the other peoples inside or outside your country, so you must stand up and talk to your leader. Then he's not your right leader. You have to vote because your voice is gone. So you can vote for a right leader and you can take your own leader accountable, because this is how the democracy is working in developed countries. So use this democracy that you have as framework. Go and talk to your leaders. And for the business communities, we know that, I mean, all the companies, the business people are also in developed countries. So they have maybe the good face, but they do not understand the realities of how indigenous people are living. How is our governance working? Or they do not know the people with disability. They just like take us, oh, it is really pity. So maybe we can fund a project for them and whatever. No, we don't need that you fund the project or you send us. It is not a charity. So you have money, you have big organization. Set up a right policy in your organization that can have a free, prior, and informed consent. Don't fund the project that harm the peoples or harm the land that peoples are living on it. Don't just send the money, send the capacity, because people need the technology, or maybe they have them on technology. They just a lack of resources to reinforce it. So do it. And the peoples who are in emerging countries, don't take the step of the developed countries that damage our nations. Do the sustainable one. You have the capacity, you are emerging, so you can do it. And for all the developing countries, I think the citizen can play a big role. They can also remind the others that we have women, we have youth, so we have all the capacity to rebuild better. And we have to go to the sustainable development. And I think at the same time, if we take these different actions, it can help us to rebuild better and respect our rights as the vulnerable maybe, but the people who are left behind, I prefer.
And
I just have to underscore, Hindou. Oh, sorry, Eddie, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to, because I think Hindou said something really important, and it's something that I've been percolating on. Look, you know, for those of us who bear the brunt of all of these crises, right? And who live through injustice, racial injustice, disability, exclusion, sexism, all of these systems of oppression, you know, it's not necessarily our job to educate the rest of the world on how to demonstrate meaning solidarity. We need to save ourselves also. We are in the thick of things. We are experiencing violence on an epic scale. We are experiencing exclusion on an epic scale. We are literally fighting for our lives. So the additional burden of having to sort of, help people who have enormous privilege figure out how they demonstrate support, I think it's an unfair burden, right? And I think it's not also a question of pity. I think we're all in this together. The world is on fire. The sky is falling. We are all navigating the vicissitudes of what it means to be a human being on the planet living today. So it's not the whole power dynamic that there's one group that's supposed to save another group. That is a completely flawed and problematic perspective. I think we all need to put our hands to the wheel, join forces, because if we all want to live lives that are prosperous and meaningful, it is in our interest that we stand up for justice and equality. So, I want to echo what Hindou said earlier. It's not a question of pity at all. It is in your interest, it is in my interest to do the work of liberating the most marginalized segments of society, because when I am free and you are free, we are all free.
It's exactly right. And I think this idea of burden is such a resonant one, because we've all been in that position where you are the person that has to explain to someone else what your reality is, as though you haven't had to do that a million other times. And you think, just try to put yourself in my position. It's enough now, But at the same time, there is this reality that when there isn't that conversation, we end up with the situations that Hindou alluded to, where the equivalent of helping my fellow man or just being a citizen of the world is, I did this random project that I, built a house somewhere, and so now I feel better about myself, but did that actually have an impact? Or did it just allow me to put something on social media or sort of say I've done a good thing, And that's everything from the individual citizen who is just going to do a volunteer activity on a morning and then says, well, that's enough for the next year, all the way up to companies, as Hindou said, who, when they think about CSR, maybe they're not actually thinking on a holistic level. They're just doing one project and then putting it up on their social good page, and that's enough. So there is this balance of, it's not necessarily education. I almost think it's true empathy. And maybe that would be good for us to talk about a little bit here, because I'm so struck right now by this attitude that seems to certainly have always existed, but it seems to be more prevalent, or at least more visible than it's ever been, where it's almost as though if for me to have more, my neighbor needs to have less, that's okay, because the goal is for me to have more. And if he chooses or she chooses to not fight for that, then that's just his hard luck. And I'm amazed by that, because I don't think any parent raises their child that way and says, it's okay, stomp on everyone who, is going to be potentially in your way, and just go about and live your life if that's possible for you. And yet we do have a world now where there's a lot of performing of virtue and performing of empathy, but I'm not always sure that it's actually there. So how do we infuse that into the conversation in a way that maybe alleviates that burden, so that you don't have to answer the question, because the person is actually thinking deeply about your experience and trying to truly put themselves in your position, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, you're really totally right. I mean, I don't know, maybe I can say, oh, you understand the word of Indigenous peoples and the word of the most vulnerable, maybe the people with disability. You really understand the feeling. I give you just like an example. When we come through the COVID, so the people who are in developed countries, they start like knowing the neighbor from the same buildings, or just going out because there are kids there. And then they start like sharing it in the TVs, in the radios. Yeah, there is a positive part of the COVID, because I know the name of my neighbor, I can say hi. And then like I can go to the supermarket, I know the cashiers, I can say hi. I'm like, really? Is it that you need the COVID to remind you that you are human? You need to reconnect with others? So let me tell you how Indigenous peoples live. We live as community. We know each other, we respect each other. And that's why like the intergenerational education for us is very important. Why they say you have to respect your elders. It is not just like because your elder is bigger than you, it can beat you or whatever. No, it is a culture. It is how you can live in harmony between each other, and how you can understand if your neighbor didn't eat and you have the plenty of the food, it's not mean you are superior than him or whatever. So it's mean like how you can share better all the resources. You are all a human species. You can be white, black, you can be man, woman, you can be whatever. You are the same, because at the end of the day, you need food to eat, you need water to drink, you need air to breathe. So they need to rethink about how the education will be, how they can reconnect with the others as human beings, and that maybe can make them understand how Indigenous peoples are living, how the people with disability or gender or whatever are living. So I'm really like your reflection of this way of seeing the others differently, and then it is not the same way they are raising them kids. It is all cultural. Then all need to be reset, and this is the system who can help us to rebuild better our future together.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what you've just said, Hindou. I think the other important thing to remember is that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, it's very easy to just sort of understand them as a public policy initiative or public policy campaign. These 17 development goals are deeply personal. The goals are about the individual lives and the individual lived experiences of communities around the world. So I suppose another word for activism is empathy. That is really the work that we do. It's about being decent to people who are different from you, but who are also navigating the planet as fellow human beings, right? So it's really about understanding what your obligation, moral and social and political obligation is as a human being living on the planet today, right? I call that activism. Another word for that is decency. It's empathy, it's dignity, it's agency, it's freedom. That's really what it is. And I don't think it's a question of, I fundamentally believe that freedom and liberation is like a positive feedback loop. The freer we are, the freer we get. The freer we, when we liberate ourselves in our communities, there's more freedom and more liberation that exists for everybody. It's not a pie. You don't take 3/4 of freedom and then there's only 1/4 left for you. It doesn't work that way. It's expansive and there's enough for everybody on the planet, right? So I think it really comes down to the way we conceive of ourselves as human beings living on the planet, right? And that's why I think the SDGs provide a good framework for the world, because it's supposed to transcend these ideological and political boundaries that we have set up for ourselves. And ultimately that comes to deep empathy, not pity, not charity, but empathy.
It's so true. And I have to say, in this virtual environment, when you said another word for activism is empathy, I got so excited. And then a phone rang in here and I thought, oh my God, somebody is calling to say exactly. But I love that this is the world we're in. This is the reality we're in. And it's a human reality. And it's wonderful to hear you guys reflect on it, but it also really makes me think of this whole idea of intersectionality, because the disabilities community and the Indigenous community certainly are two communities that we can say traditionally have been marginalized and have been left behind. But it's not that their issues naturally overlap to a person who's generally thinking about sustainable development. It's not that any of the different communities obviously all align, and yet they do all obviously align on a human level, on a global level. And I thought, as you guys were both reflecting on this question, that idea of intersectionality, in a strange way, because we are having to force ourselves to say, oh, this person's different, how do I relate to them? It almost reinforces this idea that the differences are deeper than they actually are. And I think that's something we really need to think about. It is truly a mindset shift, and it's a culture, an almost global culture in a way that is spreading more because we're not living in communities, as Hindou pointed out, in the way that we should be. And so I guess how do we as activists, as people who are trying to get people to shift that mindset, how do we start to take these frameworks like intersectionality that are useful to us, but push them forward into like more soul level changes, so that people aren't just saying, oh, I know the lingo, right? Or I get it academically, but they're actually deeply recognizing that on a central intuitive level, this means something. And so when they're going through their lives, it's not like they have to go through an index of how do I approach this situation, but they actually are feeling it at the core. What do we recommend? Is it reading books? Is it doing things differently? Is it just exposure? Give me your thoughts.
You know, my first thought is that I think we need to really attend to the aspirations of people. What is the vision that people have for their lives, right? As a disabled person, as a Black person, as somebody from the continent of Africa living in Johannesburg, the aspiration that I have for my life is I want a life that is meaningful. I want joy. I want community. I want fresh air. I want clean water. I want food. I want to be able to really live out my life as a full human being on the planet. When we are able to attend to the aspirations of people, we'll realize that these compartmentalizations don't really serve us all that well, right? Because what does it mean to be your understanding of disability is so reductive because it will only ever be understood in the context of logistics, in the context of a ramp, in the context of legislation. But behind that reductive understanding, there are real human beings with emotions and aspirations and fears and anxieties. And so I think we really need to look behind the statistics, right, behind the data, and begin to really illuminate the fullness of the human being that's represented by that data, right? And this is why I come back to this idea that the global goals are really personal. Injustice is personal. Inequality is personal, right? And so coming back to the personal nature, the emotional nature of what it means to navigate through all of these systems on a day-to-day basis, that is when you begin to unlock empathy. And that is when you begin to see that people embody a multiplicity of experiences. We are never just one thing. We are many things. And that's part of the joy and the beauty of what it means to be a human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, brother. But I think, yes, people will think like, okay, may you recommend me a book to read to understand better, or a film to watch, or a documentary to watch to understand better. So I'm like, you need to think yourself that the world that we are sitting on it was built on the knowledge of the generations before us. So those knowledge are serving still. And that's how we as Indigenous peoples living. We have our own value, we have our own civilizations, and we is still keeping those value among us. That's why we are fighting for the collective rights. We are fighting for protecting our environment as a duty. So it is not written in the book. It is not in the TV. And even if I wanted to write one of the knowledge, I cannot translate it through the language or French, English, Arabic, or whatever UN language or the peoples can understand, because it's so deep in the nature and in the culture. So peoples need just to go out to understand that we are all human. So if I can do it, he can do it. Not just, when I see the developed countries, kids, they have everything in the supermarket. And when they go to the supermarket, they just like choosing, reading, and passing to the cashiers, paying, or now they have automatic cashiers and passing. But you cannot learn like that. The life is built on the social relationship. We still have our open market. When you go and you buy like a vegetables, you know that is coming from where and when and whose and what is it's called, how it's grow up. Maybe today it's very tiny carrot than yesterday who was big, because just of the nature. It is not something, but it is the nature that play. You can get big today vegetables on small. So when you go out, you can understand all these differences. You cannot just choose by reading or pass through the things. So then the second is, it is so important to learn from the outside. The diversity is very important. So peoples have different knowledges, they have different ideas, they know how to grow up differently. That's why like I'm always learning from Eddie, my brother. We are coming from the same African country, but he's in South Africa. I'm from Chad. There are a different landscape. There are peoples. We are the same, but we have our complementarity. So that's richness. Let us keep it. This is the things we cannot learn also in the book or in the TV. So those relationships can help us maybe to better understand the life of other and better, respect our culture and our identity.
So it is about seeking true connection, right? Not necessarily trying to learn in a way that is always academic or always creating a wall, recognizing the difference, but to actually try to connect on a deeper level. I want to flip to the other side. What is the role of anger, do you think? Because I am so struck as we sit here, I think we get fired up about this stuff because it's real, but I am also, it's more than fired up, right? I think there is this sense that like, for goodness sake, why are we still here? Why are we having this conversation in this way? And I love, Hindou, the idea of you being like, I roll my eyes at these people because what are you asking me right now? And I think, you know, that is a tough feeling to feel, but it also is a motivating one. And I think how, for the many people around the world who are feeling angry right now, how do we make that anger productive? And how do we translate it into something that helps us to connect rather than encourages us to build walls?
Well, I think it's about channeling whatever the emotion is, because I think it's in a range of emotions. It's anger, it's disappointment, it's hurt, it's frustration, it's trauma, it's isolation, it's many different things. And all of those emotions tend to exist at the same time. And I think it's about harnessing those emotions in order to make change in the world. Because again, I think it's so important that we must never forget that people right now, as we're speaking, having this conversation, are really living out these things in real time, right? They're on the ground right now, battling multiple things at the same time, battling the COVID-19 pandemic, battling environmental and ecological collapse, battling economic deprivation, all of these things, navigating them simultaneously. And so I think it's about empathy again. So recognizing that there are real people behind these statistics that we rattle off with ease. And it's about recognizing that, there is no shame in anger. Without the emotion, the policy is just sort of suspended. It's floating in the air with no real purpose, right? So the emotion channels, it provides an impetus to the policies and to the legislation and all of the things that we need to be doing in order to make change in the world. And again, that's part of activism. It's part of empathy. I can't imagine any other way to move through the world without feeling something about these issues.
Yes, just to come to this hunger. Hunger is very important because it can build a positive emotion somewhere, and it can keep also attention. People can just shut up and listen, because why? You are really tired. You don't mind, you are tired, and you build that in your forces and go face something that maybe it is impossible if you are not really very angry to go there. And I got like an example on it when I was the co-chair. I was negotiating as the co-chair of the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change. I was sitting in the room where it was only like the country delegate, white man with the black suit sitting around the tables and then just like negotiating around the text, putting like, no, I am going to put a bracket here. I put a full stop here. No, it is not may, it is must. They took us 9 days over the text of 3 pages. They put over 900 brackets. Because I can't put a bracket in must, you come and put a double bracket because you are not agreeing with me. 9 days, because we have 2 weeks of the negotiations. it's get me so mad because it was the last day, and then they say, okay, if you didn't get the consensus, it's fine. We send it to the co-presidency, not to the SAPSTA presidency, and then we will wait for the next year. I really get very hungry in this room, and then I stand up in the table and say, like, you are not a peoples. You do not think about the real peoples. You just like using all the 9 days into bracket must and will and full stop. And then there are peoples that dying about the climate change back home. And you are telling me you are going to change it for the tomorrow, just for the next year. It is impossible. You have to finalize it right now because you are killing my people. I started just like crying. I don't know how. Negotiating from country. I'm negotiating from indigenous peoples. I feel the responsibility that I represent them, and they deserve this right, even they are not in the room, even they do not understand what is happening. But that helped. Immediately they open their negotiation for the next day, and we come up with the decisions. I really experienced that myself. So an individual hunger can get through a right solutions, or a collective hunger can make a movement. It can change the entire nations. It can make really a good impact. And I really encourage us to use our hunger to turn it to the positive way, to think about those who are back home, and to give the evidence why we are hungry, not just so we are hungry for nothing, but for the reason, and we need this reason to accelerate what we are doing and right now. So I think if we use all that, it can help us to build back better.
Yes.
Oh, Hindou, my heart was beating so fast as you were telling that story because I was getting so angry. But the wonderful lesson, and I'm so glad that you shared that so that we can move to the end of our conversation on that note, is that it can be channeled, and it can be channeled to such incredible effect. But to Eddie's point, you have to feel it, and you have to be willing to feel it, and you have to lean into that emotion. And if you share it, if you spread it, it allows other people to build empathy in that way. So we just have literally 1 minute to go. Any taglines, final takeaways? What's the one sentence that you want people to take away from this conversation, if there was one?
The one sentence I would say is that we have the capacity to turn it around, and that the solutions lie within marginalized communities. Let's amplify our voices, and let's be the ones to usher humanity into a new era.
Hindou, 30 seconds.
Empathy, justice, equity, inclusiveness. We don't have time, but we have to do it right now.
Oh my goodness, I almost don't need to say it, but as we kicked off this SDG Action Zone and this session, I just thought, we're figuring it out on the fly, but there are literally no two people I would be happier to figure it out with than you two. So thank you for showing us a way forward. Thank you for always doing the incredible work that you do. Apparently I'm gonna cry, but that's what happens here in the SDG Action Zone because we are doing it together. So thank you, Eddie and Hindou, and we'll see you all in the SDG Action Zone for the rest of today and for 2 more days to come.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, both of you. Bye.
Bye-bye.